Hello, and welcome to the Faith and Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 13th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 18th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited that, like we've been stating, this is that growth season of the year, being in that season after Pentecost, and yes, I will admit, John is hitting us hard with some deep theology, which I think in certain ways is good, but in certain ways it also makes it, I think, harder to be able to kind of talk about a science tie-in. But I think we found something this week that will work really well. And it's these ideas that John brings is more heady. They're just more thought-provoking. And I think there is a part of that actually does feel very realistic to be thinking about this from a scientific perspective. Because in a lot of processes within this, science has a lot of processes of thinking about and processing how are we handling these different things? How are we moving through these different ideas? How are we building upon ideas that have been coming before? And that means that we need to be able to keep thinking and having these thought-provoking conversations. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to look back at last week's question, which was, have you seen the importance of these endosymbiotic types of relationships? Remember last week we were talking about how mitochondria becoming part of our DNA, how it was an endosymbiotic relationship that it was absorbed into the cell. And how have we seen these types of relationships? And I thought an interesting response was, we do it with ourselves. Relationships of marriage or close friendships, I think in a lot of ways can be like that. Parent to kid can be some of these types of endosymbiotic relationships where it's a beneficial relationship for both sides for various different reasons. And I can definitely echo the person who responded, my wife has different strengths than I do, and I have different strengths than my wife. And both of them are very important. Both of them at times bring challenges as well. But I think it's one of these things that we are able to mutually benefit and work together to be able to get something, being able to work together, calm each other down, or be able to see beyond things or coming from a different perspective that allows us to be able to see and grow beyond. And I think that's one of the big aspects that's so amazing about these types of relationships. And in a lot of ways, it's something that we should be striving for within our church communities as well. Just our relationships that we're able to have people come in from different perspectives, different ideas, and be able to work together to move us toward these types of relationships that are deep, thought-provoking, and challenge sometimes our own understandings of things. And that's an important part of this whole thing. And I think that's one of the things within the faith we have to be able to keep doing is challenging ourselves to keep growing, because how are you going to find those endosymbiotic relationships if you aren't ever challenged? At some point, the cell was challenged to be able to bring in the mitochondria to see if it was going to work. And yes, it was a huge success, but there was still risk within that. There was still a challenge within that. So let's just jump right into it here. The semi-continuous Old Testament text this week is from 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 10 to 12, and chapter 3, verses 3 through 14. Chapter 2 is just purely in here for the aspect of us recognizing that King David has now died, and especially that we're doing this semi-continuous, that King David has died, his son Solomon now has taken the throne. And so then we get this conversation between Solomon and God. And God coming to Solomon and what are you needing? What are you wanting? So that we can continue this type of relationship that we've had with Israel. And Solomon goes on this nice kind of like manifesto talking about how the steadfast love that his father David had and recognizing that from that, he was able to actually be the king that Israel was needing, realizing that there was still shortcomings that his father had, but it was still able to guide Israel in the way that it needs to be. And that's where he comes to in verse 9, to give your servant, therefore, understanding, mind to govern your people, able to discern what is good and evil, for who can govern this great people of yours? So this idea that Solomon is then getting to the point of, I need wisdom. I need this understanding that's deeper than myself to be able to do this. This is where we get the familiar text of not only because the Lord had seen that he was asking for discernment and not asking for riches or long life, that as long as Solomon continues to walk in the precepts of what his father had done and continues to follow the will of the Lord, that not only will he get this discerning mind, but he will also then be able to get these other gifts of riches and long life as well. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 111, all 10 verses of it. And I feel like some of these Bibles you'll get subtitles, and the beginning of wisdom, I think actually summarizes this really well. It's recognizing that we should be praising the Lord for everything that God has done, the honor, the majesty, the works, the righteousness. But in all of that, that we recognize in doing that, in spending that time and acknowledging that God is doing all this, that this is the beginning of us being able to deeper understand what God is really about, being able to then start embedding this within ourselves, and that in doing that, we end up inheriting this fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of us understanding what God is really about and being able to then move forward both lovingly and fearfully in a good, healthy fear where it's not we're taking advantage, but this fear of and challenging us to strive forward that we are striving for, and God is going to help guide us with wisdom. The other Old Testament text this week is from Proverbs chapter 9, the first 6 verses of it. And this is an interesting image that we get here of wisdom, is that wisdom has this house and has all these different amazing things, animals, food, wine, and it's basically wanting us to sit and eat the bread, drink the wine, and realize that in the coming together, gathering around, eating, conversing, that then we are able to actually have insight and wisdom. And it's, again, this interesting idea, especially within the 21st century, where we are sitting and eating to gain wisdom. This sit here and spend time for a while, take a break so that we can actually get to the root of some of this stuff. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 34, verses 9 to 14. This is a psalm then recognizing in order for us to have that type of wisdom and being able to sit with wisdom, as the proverb is stating, that we then have to be seeking the Lord and recognizing that there are going to be times that things are difficult, but yet we realize that God has continued to provide. God has continued to be there and make sure that things are taken care of. And so that we continue to pursue and look after God, and that we are striving to do our best, that is when we will continue to start getting to those tables with the Lord to be able to get that insight and wisdom. The New Testament text this week is out of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 to 20. This is again that continuation of Paul talking to the people of Ephraim, and this idea of how we have to pursue the wisdom of what God is talking about, not necessarily what we decide. And that means that we need to be able to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we need to be careful. We need to be looking for ways that we are connecting and acknowledging God instead of finding ways that potentially can take us away from that. So this whole idea of counting our days and recognizing the time and recognizing that it's precious, but also recognizing that this is something that potentially can bring us closer to the Lord and really be able to acknowledge that in us. The gospel text this week is again out of the book of John, chapter 6, verses 51 to 58. This is continuing this bread of life discourse that we are getting, that I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven, and whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. Now, this is where we start getting a little bit more pushback and continuing that, where the Jews are kind of saying, how are we supposed to eat of this flesh? I mean, you're living. Like, what does this mean? And Jesus kind of continues to lay into this eating of my flesh and drinking of my blood, and especially being on this side of the cross, we have a better understanding of what Jesus is kind of getting at in talking about that this is a food that fulfills long term, that this is something that's everlasting, that this is something that goes beyond just the simple concept of eating, that this is going to be something that's filling for the long haul. that this bread is coming down from the ancestors and it's not something that passes away, but this is from heaven itself. This is different than what has been done before. And so it's this whole concept and understanding of theology that we get with John, but also the beginning of us being on this side of the cross, understanding there is some depth here, and we'll get into it a little bit. But again, it's this whole idea of kind of tying into wisdom that we're seeing coming through strong and clear this week. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to look at these different texts. There's some great commentaries over there on a weekly basis. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really like how they lay out the text week to week, along with the art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even daily devotions. There's a lot of great resources over here, and again, it can complement Working Preacher quite well, that you're getting a little bit different things and a little bit different perspective. And I think that's one of the things that can be really beneficial to be able to help you continue to grow in this faith and be able to deepen one's connection with the Lord, is being able to just spend more time around it. And so if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that also. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter. The Roundtable gives you, like this, the weekly lectionary and being able to bring in ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies. It's an amazing resource. And especially if you're sitting down and listening to this podcast week after week for a half an hour each week, I think you'd really enjoy reading through some of these different commentaries or homilies, you could put it, as people are thinking about and taking these texts and going with that, whatever direction that they need to with that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Rising publications. This is a monthly newsletter that talks about, yes, some more events that are going on in the upper Midwest, but along with also some occasional different notices, ideas, different things that be potentially going on. I'd highly recommend both of these resources, and both of these will be the first link down in the show notes. Wisdom is a difficult subject to get our heads around quickly and easily. So if we go to Merriam-Webster, you get a couple definitions here. The ability to discern inner qualities and relationship, a good sense or judgment, general accepted belief, accumulated philosophical or scientific learning, knowledge, a wise attitude, belief, or course of action, the teaching of the ancient wise men. It's difficult to kind of quickly and easily be able to discern and just be able to comprehend what wisdom is. Wisdom isn't necessarily something that's just given. It's something that accumulates over time, something that takes time, something that isn't just readily there. But there are practices in which we can do to be able to help us get to these states of wisdom. And each of us, I would argue, has wisdom in certain areas. It's the question on if we share it, that the wisdom gets passed along. And when you think about it from that perspective, is that each of us has our own wisdom. I think then it starts to become easier to start seeing it in and amongst us and around us, and realize that when we're looking at all these texts we had this week and how all of them are talking about wisdom, it becomes easier for us to start seeing that this is a character of who God is wisdom, and that God is willing to share it with us if we give it the time to acknowledge it and spend time with it. One of the things that I think is really easy to start seeing the wisdom on how God is in control of all this, to be able to recognize the beauty of the environment that we have, the beauty of how there is a cycle to everything. There is life, there is death, and out of death becomes life again. For instance, when you think about plants like we did last week, there's a lot of different nutrients that plants are needing. Like we talked about last week with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. If a plant doesn't get what it is needing, it's going to pass away. And what does that do? It then returns to the soil And thus it is adding in whatever different nutrients that it had returns back to the soil. So maybe it wasn't getting enough new nitrogen, but it's still infusing nitrogen into the soil. It is then using like detritivores and different things to help break that down. It might be using some of the bacteria that it was hoping to find to break itself down. But it's also then giving the ability for life to come again. Sometimes when we have these living soils, that's where we see these cycles. It's when we start taking things away from these soils, where it becomes a monocrop, that suddenly when it's dead, there isn't anything there that isn't already there. There isn't anything that is going to help it really produce that life, and where it struggles. That's where it's amazing when we're seeing these different ecosystems that have diverse biodiversity, where we have this diversity of life. Is so powerful because then it continues that cycle so much faster, where you have an area with monoculture. When we think about what we imagine as modern science today, and we've talked about this before, the basic scientific principles is, yes, you got to come up with a hypothesis. But part of the process of being even able to come up with a hypothesis is two things that I think also incur wisdom. It's observation and having a curious mind, and then looking into it. Any scientific paper now, you have to understand what has been done before so that you can either reconfirm or build upon the research that has been done. And even if you're going to reconfirm something, you need to then be able to go back and understand the research of what has gotten it to that point. This is why in scientific papers you are citing so many different places. You are stating the wisdom or stating where you are coming from to be building upon. Thus, if we realize that something changes, where someone had a paper and we were following something that the wisdom is later found to be false, we can start to recognize, okay, yeah, that's why you got that result, but you made an assumption here that was incorrect. Or we were having something that was able to be improved upon to recognize that our measurements weren't as accurate as they needed to be, so that thus we weren't able to get to that spot. This is all types of wisdom. I know one of the things that I find really interesting is there is a friend of mine that I know who does breeding bird surveys in the summers. And part of that breeding bird survey is, yes, the acknowledgement of wisdom of knowing what habitats are and going into an area and having a general idea of what should be there, what types of birds should be breeding there, what types of things should I be hearing. But you can't then overlook when you're actually out there and think you heard something that isn't there, and vice versa. When you start hearing something that you didn't expect, just totally let it go. It's part of then chasing down and figuring out what exactly was that. Was my mind playing tricks on me? And making sure that you are fully understanding that. Understanding the ecosystem in which those birds are in, so that we can better evolve and change and recognize what's going on. Because just like we evolve and change, God's creation evolves and changes. And I think that's another part of this. Specifically, I think we can see that with King Solomon's kind of statement, is that Solomon recognizes that the world is going to continue to evolve and it's going to continue to need wisdom, that it's not stagnant, that this is something that I'm going to continue having to do. And we get this confirmation from God that as long as you continue in these precepts, then you will get this. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, I will lengthen your life, coming from verse 14. This idea that we have to continue to go back there, continue to reconfirm, continue to figure it out, because things are going to continue to evolve and change and sometimes even get more complicated. This whole idea of then dining with wisdom as we get in Proverbs, that we sit and spend a little time and ponder and think, and then we're going to go out and do, and then we're going to come back and we're going to sit and ponder and think. And I think that is revolutionary for the world in which we're in now, because we're so used to making quick snap decisions, and that we make the decision and we move on. We make the decision and we move on. But this idea of wisdom being, no, you come and eat and we drink and we converse. It's a meal. It's not a fast food dinner. It's a full course meal here. You sit, we're there for a while. We see that even in, again, the seeking of God coming from Psalm 34, or the fear of the Lord, recognizing and being able to observe all the things that are going on around us, to be able to get to that fear, that observation piece. This is all things that we can do to be able to help us with this wisdom journey. How is Paul wrapping up, the beginnings of wrapping up this Ephesians text, is recognizing everything that the Lord has done and being able to recognize the God within each other. That's what he's been trying to kind of get to, this bickering that's been going on and getting the people to recognize in this early church. You have to look beyond each other's downfalls. Don't get caught up in it. Don't think of yourself so highly that you're looking for God within each other and being able to amplify that together. And recognizing the wisdom of what Jesus is, again, here being on this side of the cross, we can see this as a call to Holy Communion and see this as a call to the end of the book. But it's also this aspect of recognizing that if we are eating and drinking and spending time, that's when that wisdom comes. I think about when I've worked in different scientific studies. It's not the way that things are projected in the movies. It's not like we're typically in the lab mixing chemicals and eureka, alakazam, suddenly you have something and it's revolutionary. It's this process stepping, making conclusions, making ideas, testing things, seeing what works. Or when I've done field work where you go out there, you set things, and then you come back. And okay, this is what we were able to get. We were hoping to get this. We didn't get this time. Doing hypothesis after hypothesis after hypothesis, gathering the data. Okay, maybe we need to go and get more data, but there's some ideas that I have. Is there small tweaks that isn't going to affect the experiment that we could do to maybe increase something? Is that a good variable to be adding or not? If I do, we have to make note of it because now we have made some changes within the experiment, or is it not a significant enough thing to even really make note of, or make note of it, but say that we didn't think it was significant? All these different ideas, thoughts, concerns, projections, thinking about things. I think about when I was in high school, we did some live trapping of small mammals. And when I got to college, and I distinctly reached out to my high school biology teacher and asked for that data to see if I could statistically prove what I had been doing some in high school for a statistics class. And I distinctly remember getting the new data and talking it through with him because it was very different data, and deciding to, in my final paper, stating that here is the data with this and without this 1 year, this last year that we just had, and here are the reasons that I'm justifying that I don't feel that this is a good representation, because there have been a few oddities with weather and things that had happened that kind of changed the ecosystem for that year. Have I gone back to that data since? No, and it would be probably good to actually kind of go back and kind of take a peek at what's all happened. But it was also this idea that over time, when we had 10 years of data showing one thing and recognizing that there was some weird events that happened in that 11th year, to be able to have the wisdom to say, we can still run the results and show you, it shows that the habitat preference of these different small mammals, of what we were doing, the percentages changes to some of these where they weren't as significant. But if we take this year out, and we're saying that because of some of the oddities, using the wisdom of what we've been acquiring to be able to then say, I think these other 10 years are a better representation, and thus we see a stronger correlation. I think that takes time. I think within our faith, the Lord is wanting us to be able to sit there long enough to be able to recognize where things are that we are able to acknowledge the wisdom around us. I think being able to look to the environment around us and acknowledge how all of this stuff is cycles and that they work together to be able to continue to build upon things. That yes, things come and go in this life, but it still continues to move toward the better. I think about the plant that isn't able to survive and it dies. It's providing the nutrients to hopefully give the next generation a better chance. And is that not a relatable subject to who we are as humans, that we are constantly striving to try to do better, try to make things better for more people, at least for our future generations to strive to be better, whether in vain or not? We think about the last 200 years, 250 years of human civilization. It is dramatically different than the first 20 centuries of it plus. But yet, there's still things that we are trying to improve upon, trying to do better, trying to figure things out. This desire to grow and learn and obtain wisdom. But I think in all of that, I think one of the reminders that we do have to remember in this is wisdom is not quick. Wisdom takes time. It's a conversation that Solomon is having with the Lord. It's a conversation of wisdom inviting us to the table. It's us acknowledging in Psalm 111 the majesty, the works, observing God around us and putting those pieces together and connections together. We look at Psalm 34, and it's the connections, it's observing, it's recognizing all the things that God's doing, and that's when we start seeing wisdom. It's Paul reminding you got to be keeping the straight and narrow, but you're still looking and trying to connect with other people, but also trying to recognize what God's doing. And thus, that's where the Jews at this moment are struggling. There's certain ways that you can tell they're trying to move beyond where Jesus is at. And he's saying, no, sit and let's talk. I have more I want to feed you, but you're so worried and getting caught up in these things because it's twisting your head. You need to go deeper. You need to spend the time. You need to relax, take a moment, absorb the wisdom. Wisdom is not a fast food restaurant. Wisdom is an Italian meal with multiple courses. It is not quick and it's not easy, but it takes time. So the question I have for you is, where do you go to gain wisdom? Where do you go to gain wisdom? Because I think it's this process of us slowing down and taking time that we can really evaluate where we are. And in a world that moves faster and faster, I think it's easier and easier for us to feel like life is flying by and things aren't happening the way that we would hoped. And all of a sudden, where are we? I know as a young person, there's been definitely times in my life where that has happened. And I'm like, how the heck did I get here? And I would argue part of it is that I haven't taken the time to be able to do the process of wisdoming. Slowing down, reflecting, respecting where I'm at, acknowledging God in all of it, spending time processing, thinking, instead getting consumed with whatever is next. And our world does a great job of that. But if we don't ever stop and reflect, we are missing out on the true wisdom. And if we don't acknowledge and aren't able to understand that we are going through wisdom, how are we ever going to be able to pass it on? We won't be able to, because we won't even recognize that we've been able to obtain it. And I think that's part of all of this. Part of acknowledging and understanding God and seeing God is acknowledging that God is in all of this and all the things that are going on, that God's part of it. And so unless we are willing and able to take that time, take that step of acknowledgement, we're going to fall short. We're going to miss it. And that to me is a tragedy, but I think it's also a reminder for us to continue to be scientists, whether we are in a scientific field or not. We need to take that time to observe, to slow down, to process, be able to acknowledge then what God is doing, and in the process, maybe we learn a little bit on what God is really all about. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.